Hey guys, Lonewolf here. So after a couple of weeks of playing Battlefield 4 way back in late 2013, I'd pretty much settled on the defibrillator and medpack/medbag combo as my go-to gadgets for the assault class. I've more or less ignored the other lethal and tactical options since then because I just don't feel like they're worth trading out that defibrillator or the medical option. I've been re-examining this recently and I've pretty much come to the conclusion that the M320 HE just isn't effective enough against light armor for it to be justified. When it comes to taking out enemy infantry, I don't feel like I need anything quite as crude as a grenade launcher. They might be quite useful for flushing people out of difficult spots as that sort of extra contingency, and I do get this and I have no problem with that. It just doesn't happen often enough to justify always taking these with you. You're not going to be taking out many of these people in difficult to get to spots in each life, and if you want to actually make use of that gadget, you end up just walking around with a grenade launcher to kill people, and I don't really approve of that. So I've been looking at the other options, the tactical and the shotgun options. When it comes to the tactical grenade launchers, most people don't choose to take a tactical grenade over their M67 or RGO grenade, so I can't see anyone using these. And so I've mostly been focusing on the shotguns, wondering whether these add something to your playstyle that you don't have otherwise. Now obviously giving up either the defibrillator or your ability to heal is a pretty massive loss for the assault class, as that's more or less what it does. And so these shotguns are going to have to be incredibly useful to justify that sacrifice. It's not just that they need to be effective, they also need to deliver you something that you didn't have before. So they can't just be good at taking people out in close quarters if your assault rifle is already just as good at doing that. That really wouldn't justify having them. So I've been spending quite a bit of time with them, just going around and seeing whether there are enough situations, in which they really come into their own. For the vast majority of my playtime with these gadgets, I took the underslung rail in place of my foregrip so that I could switch to them faster. I felt like if I'm giving up one of my vital gadgets for this thing, I might as well make it as accessible as possible so that I can get best use out of it. However, it should be noted there are limitations on what you can attach to the underside of what assault rifles, so I've drawn up a chart so you can see for yourselves. When you equip the M320 alongside the underslung rail on either the AK, AK-12 or QBZ, it'll actually be replaced by the GP30 grenade launcher. Cosmetically this is different, but it actually shares exactly the same statistics, so don't worry about that. Now the next thing I wanted to find out was whether or not using the underslung rail is actually worth it. Considering it takes up that attachment slot, I want to find out what the difference in switch times actually is. So I went onto the test range to see if there is a big difference between running the gadget standalone or underslung on your assault rifle. I replicated the test with both the M320, M26 and the GP30. The GP30 turned out to be identical to the M320, so I'll just show that test here. Now to do this, what I did was held down the trigger as soon as I started the switch, and if you look down at the bottom here where I paused the footage, you'll see that the gadget is not actually selected in my inventory yet. It's not been highlighted. That's because this is exactly one frame before that happens, and I'll run the footage at half speed and then pause it again as soon as you can see pellets strike the target in front. So roughly half the time for the underslung. Bear in mind that you do need to half this amount of time if you want to find out how long it would actually take in game, because this footage is run at half speed and I couldn't figure out exactly how to make the timestamp reflect that. Now I'm going to run it again for the M26 and you'll see here that the difference is actually even more minute. So I'm not sure as I would necessarily feel like I could justify running the underslung rail, but you might. It's up to the individual, and it would depend a bit on the weapon as to whether or not you needed that underbarrel grip as well. So enough with the preamble, how do these weapons actually fare in game? Well, to start off with effectiveness, these shotguns really are no joke. The M26 Mass and Dart do identical damage to the 870 MCS, which is a primary shotgun and one of the strongest in my opinion. I can't really speak for spread pattern or stuff like moving while aiming down sights accuracy, but when it comes to damage they are the same, and I would say they feel very similar. So it's like having a primary shotgun in your gadget slot. The only big difference I found was that the M26 Mass is magazine fed. Personally, I don't have a huge preference between tube-fed and magazine-fed shotguns. I know a lot of people do, but for me it doesn't make a huge difference, at least with pump-action shotguns. When it comes to semi-autos I feel a little bit differently, but with pump-action shotguns it doesn't bother me so much, and the M26 Mass is incredibly effective. The M320, however, is even more so. This, you only get one shot, there's no magazine or tube, but it just hits like a truck. This weapon does more damage than any other shotgun in the game, unless you're counting stuff like canister shells, which nobody does. It does 25 damage maximum and drops off to the same minimum damage as most flechette shotguns do. This makes it incredibly effective in close quarters where it only needs 4 out of its 12 pellets to kill, and at a long range theoretically, if you were to land every pellet you could kill someone across the map. That is just insane. It's a huge amount of damage output and it makes it incredibly reliable in close quarters and even at medium range. Now there is of course the frag and the slug option available for the M26, but these basically have exactly the same problems that they do on the 870 MCS or the Spaz 12 or any of the pump action primary shotguns. So I didn't really spend any time with these. I just don't feel like it's a very effective way to run shotguns. They're pretty weak, and I'm not going to talk too much more about that and just focus instead on the dart and the mass. Now without a doubt both of these shotguns is very effective and very powerful in close quarters, but do they add enough to your loadout to make them worth giving up either the defibrillator or the med pack/med bag? Well, personally I feel like this comes down to how much versatility they add. So for me, although I tried it out, I don't feel like running one of these on an AEK is really worthwhile. You can already do incredibly well in close quarters and at medium range, and you should probably put your underbarrel attachment to better use, improving your ranged capability, and just take the defibrillators. What I did have probably more success with, or felt like I was doing better with, were weapons like the AUG A3 or the AK-12 or the M16 even, which is a very good long range weapon and can be a little bit tricky in close quarters if you haven't fully mastered it, where I feel like these shotguns actually do deliver that versatility. They let you go into close quarters and feel confident. You can go into a building and clear it with the M26 mass and not worry too much about the fact that you're using a weapon that isn't optimized for that. You absolutely are. Perhaps because of the slightly limiting maximum ammo count, which can be a bit of a problem, the M320 feels a little bit more like a backup weapon. You only get one shot, and whilst you can use it to breach into a room, you then have to switch over to your primary, which, as I've already said, is likely to be something not particularly well optimized for that. So it feels like something you might want to use as a backup weapon if somebody surprises you and gets right up in your face. The other thing I found both of these weapons very useful for was getting up to the top of elevators and having to clear the top. I'm sure you're all very familiar with getting blown up by C4 or people just shooting into elevator shafts, camping at the top on rooftops. If you use the M320 DART and come out of one of them, very often I was able to kill someone using C4 before they could actually detonate. So having played at least a dozen games with these shotguns, the conclusion depends a lot upon what map you're playing. Perhaps a little unexpectedly, if you're playing a close quarters map, I don't think these are a great option. You want to just take a primary weapon that's very good at that. So if you're playing Pearl Market or Operation Locker, I feel like you're better off with just something like an AEK or a FAMAS, even if you can manage the reload time. You don't want to have to be switching back and forth between your close quarters shotgun and your long range weapon that isn't going to get used all that often. If you're playing a very long range map, again, I don't feel like it's particularly necessary because you're not going to get forced into close quarters combat all that often, and it would seem to be a bit of a waste not to take one of the other gadgets instead. Where these really shine is on maps like Zavod 311, where you have to switch between very close quarters combats, for example in the tunnels or on one of the objectives, and long range combat when you're moving between them. There's a lot of range there, and you do actually get the time to switch between them. You know when you're going into a different environment. This is where I think these really excel. It's got to be a map where you could justify taking a long-range weapon in the first place, and where you feel like you need a bit more close quarters firepower. It's on those maps where you often feel caught off guard by people getting very up close to you, but where you also want to be able to hit people at range, where having one of these as a backup or even as an alternative weapon is incredibly useful. And I think if you use it on maps like Zavod or even Flood Zone, then you'll have quite a lot of fun with these. It can really take people by surprise if they see and hear you using a slow firing assault rifle at range, and then you're able to put them down quite so quickly when they get in close quarters. But overall, do I think it's worth taking one of these shotguns over either the medbag or the defibrillator? Well, definitely not the medbag. I just think that's probably the most useful gadget in the game. It keeps you alive. And the defibrillator, as I said, depends a lot on the map. There are only certain maps where I would recommend using one of these shotguns, but also on whether or not you're working with an organized squad or with good teammates. If you are, and they're sticking close to you and they're helping you get objectives, then it's definitely worthwhile being able to get them up and effectively double your firepower. But if they're not, if you don't have much team cohesion going on anyway, it might just be better to further your own individual effectiveness, in which case, depending upon the map, it might be a good idea to take one of these. What it's taught me is that I should perhaps re-examine my loadout between games for the assault class a little more than I do. at present, I'm really just sticking with the same gadgets and using them on any round, and now I think I might look at this a little bit more, but I won't use the underslung rail. I just don't feel like the difference in switch times is worth it. So do give these shotguns a try, particularly on maps where there's plenty of long and close range combat and where there's a nice clean divide between the two so you have time to switch. Anyway, that's pretty much all I want to say on this. I hope you enjoyed and found it useful. Please leave a like and subscribe if you did. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.